Decent Exposure describes itself as a helper for creating declarative interfaces for Rails. So what does that mean? I want to start by looking at this is pretty boilerplate scaffolding kind of code. Mainly what you see here is employees who work for a company. And so you might have a URL that passes in the company ID, and you'd have a before filter that loads the company up into an instance variable. And on the index, you're going to use that company to pull out all the employees and set that as an instance variable. This is pretty standard stuff, and we did this stuff for years and years and years, and we're fat, dumb, and happy, and it was all cool. There's a couple things about this that are pretty lame. One of which is I have come to really hate before filters. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, particularly you get like maybe a large controller, maybe you shouldn't have large controllers, but you get a stack of filters, or you may have some before filters sitting in your application controller, and you may have some filters sitting in your existing controller here, and you forget about them, and you're like, man, why isn't this happening? This request is just failing, and I don't know why. And so you just have to go through and find, oh yeah, there's this filter that's failing somewhere in the filter chain, and I don't know why, but I can just figure this out maybe. And it shows up in the log, so maybe there's not a good reason for not remembering about it, but it happens. The other thing is that these filters are really hard to test. They're kind of magic. They happen, you're kind of testing the side effect of them. That this filter gets run and this guy gets set. And so you might have a test that says something like assert that company is assigned, which is okay, but it's an indirect. You're testing the side effects of what's going on. So there's that. And you also end up with situations where you've got this before filter that you're doing, and you find out, oh, I don't really want it to run on this one. So you end up with like a bunch of onlys and accepts, and it ends up being weird logic sitting up here. Know why that just happened? It ends up being weird logic you end up getting like a bunch of, oh, this before filter should run here but not there, and only here, or maybe only here except for there, and it's just weird. And we used to think it was pretty cool that, hey, we want to run this stuff all the time, but it turns out not so much. The other thing, and this is my own personal opinion, and it's not my own, there are other people share this too, but I am not a fan of instance variables. I think instance variables, and this guy here, he quoted that instance variables are really about maintaining internal state, and exposing those instance variables seems kind of lame. And I think that having instance variables, I don't really like to use them at all. I end up using like attr accessible or something like that in order to deal with internal state. And maybe even make those protected or private if I should. Jim Wyrick and I actually have had quite a few conversations on this, and that's why I say it's my personal opinion. Some people are not as hard-nosed as I am. I think when I see an at variable inside a class, that usually is maybe missing something somewhere. I don't know exactly what I could point to about it, but anyway, in views, it seems really lame in views, because now you're making this instance variable a public interface for rendering views, which seems a real violation of the object-oriented principles. So what's a better way to do that? So here's a different way to do the same thing. In this case, we have a couple of protected methods, and Rails lets us define them as helper methods. And here we have instance variables, but they're really only used for memoization. And so this helps us with caching. We don't actually worry about this till we call the company helper or the employee's helper. And it's almost the same code, but instead of using an @ variable, it's a method here, right? And in your views, because these are helper methods, you would actually turn around and say the same thing. It would be, instead of saying @employee or employees each, you would just say employees each. It's a method. And that does a couple things for you. One, it brings all of these exposed anymore. And it also makes these, so in your testing, you can actually mock these guys out now. So your controller specs, you can mock this out and not have to worry about hitting the database. Or the other thing that it does for you is that all this this resource loading is still in one place. And if you want to change this, instead of being employees all, employees active, you can do that pretty easily. Because these are helper methods, this guy here, he's not really doing anything at all anymore, right? You don't have to, you could actually just remove this whole thing and just have it do the default action, which is to render the template. And then inside your templates, you would just reference these helpers and it would all work out just fine. So you can do this, and this is a good practice. Sometimes it gets a little bit more tricky. If you're trying to load up a singleton resource and this helper method is working across all the different actions, you have to say, oh, if I'm doing a show action, which means that the ID is being passed in, then I should do a find on it. If I don't have the ID, then I should do a new on it. It could be that there's actually another case here that if I do have the ID and I have this, then maybe what I want to do is do a find and then do an update with these parameters. There's lots of different conditions here. And so you can think about this and you can do this really well. Or that's basically what decent exposure does. Decent exposure gives this method called expose that it just basically does what you hope it would do. Here where it's doing an expose employee, it says, oh, it looks at this and says, oh, this must be an instance of the employee class. And because I'm in the employees controller, if I get an ID, I should use that to load up this employee. The other thing that it does is if it sees a plural version of the singular, it scopes it within this. So it's not just going to find any old employee. It's only going to find an employee, which is a set in this set of employees. So you can have this other resource, company ID, and he does a pretty good job of guessing that, oh, if you pass in the company ID, then I'm going to load that guy up. He also does a really good job of guessing whether or not you're doing a show or a new or an edit or whatever. And he initializes that resource really well. And that makes your controller code pretty tight. There's a whole lot of options on here. One of the options is you could actually pass in the association here and say that this employee is associated with this company, and it'll basically do exactly like this. And this passing in this block as an optional parameter is kind of the brute force way to take the bull by the horns and force it to your will. There is most of the time, if you wanted to say, if the ID is not company_ID, you could pass in what the param name is that you should be loading it from. If you are not doing a find by ID, you're passing in a slug, you can pass in what the name of the finder method is. And it's really, man, I don't know why that keeps doing that. It's not my machine going to sleep, it's the Apple TV, I think. So I think the screensaver's kicking on. That's what it's doing. So anyway, this is a really short list of how decent exposure works. This is probably one of the shortest presentations that we've done at CincyRB. But if you look, I've got these slides up. They're using this Reveal.js. I've got this GitHub repo, which is kind of neat if you're interested in seeing how that works. This is the official home of it here on GitHub, and it has some documentations of what all the different options are. And then there's also a Rails cast on it as well, which you could take a look at. So that's basically a really short introduction to decent exposure, and I would be glad to answer questions or to try and entertain them or whatever on philosophy or whatnot.
Looks like from the views perspective.
From the views perspective, it's just another method call.
It's a helper method.
It's a helper method. So I'm going to actually just switch over and
You got a couple meetings there.
Doug's busy.
He's a busy guy.
Oh, you made a choice, but it was the wrong one.
So if you had, let's say like in, what's a good example here? Are we using this in the dashboard?
I don't know.
I don't know either.
Probably an ELO.
Probably an ELO. App controllers. Let's look at the games controller. No, we're not. That's terrible. Or awesome. Take your pick. Why is that like all wonky?
I don't know, but I think CincyRB might actually use decent exposure.
That's crazy.
So one thing that's not on your last slide is Steven's blog post about like where this came from. It's called A Diatribe on Maintaining State. He talks about like program to an interface, not an implementation, and that's like where this whole thing came from, because you're totally like linking to the implementation of the controller.
How different though if what you're doing is returning a model object, really the API almost becomes the model object itself though? I mean, what the instance access, because it's not strongly typed in any way, right? I mean, it's just, I mean, whether it comes from a parameter or an instance, to me seems a little bit almost, not 100% sure I saw that as like a huge win.
Which one? I'm confused. Which part? Are you talking about like the fetching, or what decent exposure is actually providing in terms of an interface?
Yeah, maybe not the fetching itself, but in terms of like if what you're talking about is in your view you've got an interface and the interface either has an @ symbol in front of it or not.
No, your interface to the controller is what you're changing. You're not latching onto some implementation detail of the controller, because what if I decided that instance variable is something different later? I'm providing you like a public API almost. See, I'm almost of the opinion that Ruby should have header files, because, like, I know, but it does force you to like define the public interface to a class, and we don't do a good job of that in a lot of cases.
So exposing instance variables as your interface, it's all kind of arbitrary, and it seems like too much intimacy. By providing an actual public interface, these are the methods that you use to access my object. And I don't think that we should have header files, but I don't think that we take advantage of private or protected enough to say, to communicate, even though we know the secret handshake to get around private methods, right? You can just send to them and everything works out fine. But it's a statement that says, these are internal helper methods, they're not external. But these that are public are external. Let me talk about this, because this is actually really cool that this came up. This ELO application was something that we built, I don't remember how long ago, maybe even a year ago. And it's using inherited resources. I don't know if you can read that well enough. And I used to be a huge fan of inherited resources. And I'm not sure why we're using it here, because it's hardly doing anything at all that actually takes advantage of it. Here you see in the create, there's a lot of boilerplate code in create where you like take a new thing and assign the attributes to it and then save it, and if it succeeds you go here, if it fails it goes there. Inherited resources took the guts of those methods, the index, the new, the show, the create, the update, and the destroy. Those basic CRUD actions, we do them the same way almost every time. I would say 80% of the time those actions are the same. So inherited resources said, you know what, those things are so much the same, I'm not going to type them anymore. I'm just going to guess that that's the way it's going to be, except when it's not. And when it's not, I would do something like this. Super, do the normal thing, and then do this instead of what you would normally finish with. And so inherited resource tried to abstract away all the messiness of resource loading and the behaviors of the actions, giving you a way to override those. That's not really cool though. Only one of those two things I found to be useful. One of them of loading the resources, because we load the resources the same way all the time. But the behaviors and the actions, I don't want to script that away, because it turns out if there's ever time that I'm deviating, it's from that. And so decent exposure abstracts away the resource loading, but leaves you with the behaviors and the actions that you still code yourself. So if I had to redo this with decent exposure, it would be pretty easy. So I would change this to not inherit from inherited resource, and instead just do application controller. I would still respond to HTML and JSON, and then I would say expose game. And because this is games. So there's some, I'm actually going to flip over here and load up decent exposure. There's a 2.0 release that just came out, and some of those options, so I'm going to scroll down and look at, there's an ancestor, there's a model, there's params, there's finder. He doesn't actually, I don't see how to actually scope it, so that's fine. So I'm going to say, actually I can just take this. No, that was the wrong way. Expose games, and then expose game. And that's it. So the index goes away, and what is this guy doing? So he's building up new participants, and then this guy would just say redirect to. Sorry, my native editor.
You almost made the. There it was again.
So this is what the controller would look like. And in the view, views, games. Let's look at the index. Oh, that's index rabble. Views, games. Is there no index HTML? Maybe not. What's in there? Let's look at the new. So here, instead of just saying at game, this is a method now, and so we call game. And that's pretty much all that we would change. So the question then becomes, why is this better to not have the at symbol here? And it looks like, on the surface, it looks like it's just one character different. What's the big deal? But really, it's a difference between looking at the internals of an object or looking at that object's public interface.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say the other thing, when Michael was talking the other week, I mean, you know, he mentioned how when you have instance variables, you basically get them unknowingly spread throughout all your partials too.
Yep.
It's something that you didn't mean, especially when you're coding with other people, all of a sudden you realize, like, oh my gosh, someone was using that instance method, or, you know, variable that I thought was just internal to this controller. That was actually being used in a far off partial somewhere. So I broke something by changing this thing that I thought was internal to the controller. So that's another reason not to use
That seems like a good. I guess what I was getting at is I was saying I think that the thing that you're even more so of your API though is what's in that object itself, right? And that doesn't concern you that, like, I mean, what you've got now tightly coupled is the view to the model, right, as opposed to just the view to the controller. And I mean, this looks I mean, it looks night and day is better, right? It's so much simpler to use that expose and.
I'm not sure I follow that. I think you've actually added, you've reduced the coupling because
Yeah.
you've got this interface to the controller that now I control everything that I can do with that. That game might not be always an instance of game. It might be some kind of active model serializer or some kind of other thing.
Sure, but that was never the case, or that was always the case with the
You can
mat
always do
symbol
that.
as well, right? I mean, that doesn't change that at all.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'm going to point out here is that I don't know how much of the internals of Rails you've looked at, but by far one of the ugliest pieces is what Rails has to go through to copy instance variables from the controller object to the view object. And that seems really nasty to me, is that you have internal state being copied between two objects automatically. And that seems like that's just kind of a bad idea. The other thing that you can do, which Michael would maybe like or not like, is if you put a bang on exposed bang, it forces the loading at the controller rather than happening somewhere else ways in the view.
Yeah.
Because these things are typically lazy evaluated, they don't hit the database until the first time you access them. But if you use the bang symbol, it'll cause it to go ahead and hit the database and load it up.
Is that still, so is that going to do it for both games and game?
It would do it both for every action.
So you wouldn't necessarily want games to be instantiated. You may have to really think about that.
Yeah, I agree.
You lose one of your big benefits
Of the lazy.
of not having to care which methods are used in which controllers, versus before your filter had to track only this, only here, there.
All right.
And I presume you can call those methods defined by expose from within the controller itself rather than waiting for the view to call it. If you
Yeah, you can absolutely call those in the view itself. In fact, if you wanted to, and you said, hey, I want to make sure that these games get loaded, right? Then you could just say games, and then render.
In the previous example too, you referenced, what was it, company in one of the blocks that you passed to
Right.
person.
It's
or
just a
whatever.
it's just this function games is just a method on the controller that Rails has. That it's using Rails magic to say that this is also a helper for the view. So it basically the view delegates back to the controller for those helper methods.
And only to those views. And they're not global helpers, they're just to those.
Right, inside this controller views. So anyway, I think that if nothing else, if you get tired of typing in all the boilerplate resource loading logic, decent exposure will help you there. It'll do a lot of heavy lifting for you. But it can also, I think it's still better practice in not exposing instance variables across the view boundary. And there may be some other caveats. I'm not saying that this is a silver bullet. It's just one way that I've found to simplify my controllers at a not very high cost.
Yeah. So, did you look at all at the decent configuration stuff? I don't know if that's new in 2.
I did not look very closely at it.
That is pretty cool too. It's at the bottom there if you scroll. So you can define these configurations for exposures
Yeah.
that you can then just tag them, and it seems like really useful. And their example there is an article, and you can define a configuration called sluggable, and then set the finder to find by slug and the find parameter to slug, and then just tag your exposed article with that.
You can write you can do a lot of heavy lifting on what your strategies are. You can write these custom strategies as well. Another side effect here, because you're not actually running the finders in your actions in the controller, is that if you call that a helper in the view and you get a 404 not found, or you get a record not found, the controller rescues that and returns 404. The view doesn't. The view gives you a template missing method error. And so it's a little bit different situation, and you need to probably figure out what you want to do about that. One thing is to always load your initialize them in the controller. The other is maybe you could have a different strategy like this that would handle that as well. But you could have lots of different strategies, and there's some examples. One of them is to have a strategy that takes into account can and authorizations. So you could have it loading resources and having a strategy for using authorizations and having it return then, well, I guess that would be like a 403 if it's not authorized. And you could do that as part of an extension to decent exposure that's pretty clean and straightforward.
Yeah.
From a testing perspective, does this trim down the tests that you have for your controller then? I mean, since you're, or do you actually test against those helper methods that Expose is now creating?
So this comes down to similar to like testing active record models.
Yeah.
When you have Rails macros that do heavy lifting for you, so you test those in your unit test. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. It depends on how confident you are and how you have used those macros. But there comes a point at which typing in that, hey, it should validate presence of, when you have in the model validates presence of, is that test really valuable or not? Because decent exposure is tested, and I am confident in decent exposure's resource loading, I don't feel the need to automatically write those tests until I do feel the need to write those tests.
Right. Yeah. That's right. It seems like if that's where you would end up. Like, why am I writing this when Expose?
Not to mention, if you have good integration coverage,
Yeah.
that should, I mean, most of this controller logic stuff should be covered in a good Cucumber.
I mean,
I realize I
a lot of times
think
controller
Kevin
testing
said by
anyway
taking
kind
off
of
my
gets
sweatshirt.
minimized.
I got you covered.
It's all good. All right, there's delicious Indian food, and it seems like that we could talk about this more, and I would be glad to, but I would rather do it while getting delicious Indian food and then turn it over to Super Chris.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Thanks, Doug.
Line forms this side,
Not
right through here. I'll go ahead and show you how to do it.
Grab a
Follow me into the breach.
Fine balance between guests first and leading by example.
So there's vegetarian chana masala.
No.
No. We had some miscommunication